This was the classic example of the husband and father getting back at the ex-partner by hurting their children. And that this festering resentment of everything that had happened to him meant that he struck back in what he probably thought was the only way he could, which was an incredibly evil, a self-centred thing to do. The action of a quiet sociopath, really, a terrible thing. I'm Andrew Rule, this is Life and Crimes. Today we're going to bounce off a story that's in the news. And that story is the one of Arthur Freeman, not Desi Freeman. Before Desi, there was Artie. And Arthur Freeman is that dreadful, dreadful man who threw his little daughter Darcy off the Westgate Bridge in 2009. Now, I have to say, in all these decades of covering crime and crimes, that story is one of the ones that gives me chills. I cannot drive over the Westgate Bridge without thinking about it, and I know that so many people associated in any way with the death of Darcy Freeman, and I'm talking about police, I'm talking about ambulance people, I'm talking about lawyers, specifically a lawyer friend of mine. It affected so many people because it was so dark and so awful. I raised this week because Arthur Freeman has just been bashed in jail, which won't come as a great surprise. The reality is with Arthur Freeman, he was so much on the outer with other prisoners that very early on the authorities placed him outside the mainstream prison population, and they put him in the Western Plains prison unit or whatever, away from the mainstream population, in the hope that by isolating him with certain other isolated prisoners, he wouldn't be routinely bashed or even killed. But it turns out that he's finally run up against somebody that couldn't stand the idea of what he'd done, and apparently, allegedly, possibly, that person may well have bashed him. Who knows? Might have been over the boiled eggs. We don't know. For those people who don't know or don't recall the details of the Arthur and Darcy Freeman story, which is awful, it is roughly this, that Arthur Freeman, strange man by any measure, was separating from his wife, the mother of his children, back in 2009, and his wife's lawyer, who is well known to me, represented her very ably, and they came to a settlement. And as part of that settlement, her lawyer, the fellow that I know, said, as he probably should have, it was quite a generous thing to do, he said, to show that there is no hard feelings, although my client will look after the children most of the time, not 50-50, it'll be 5 days and 2 days or whatever. To show there's no hard feelings, we would like Mr. Freeman to know that he can take his children down to the Surf Coast to see his parents this weekend. Essentially, they made this gesture that Arthur Freeman could take his kids down to one of the towns on the Surf Coast. I think it was Anglesey. It doesn't really matter which. He did that. He took the children, Darcy and her siblings, to the Surf Coast, to the town there to see his parents, and they spent the weekend there. And the agreement was that he would drive them back in time for Darcy to go to kindergarten, I think it was, to go to attend something. So the idea was he would get up early and bring the children home to Melbourne so that they'd be back in time to attend kindergarten or school or whatever it might be. But those who know this story will know that on the way he stopped his car on the Westgate Bridge, took hold of little Darcy and threw her over the bridge railing, which was the most heartbreaking thing because one of her little siblings said, "Daddy, Darcy can't swim," which I find one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever heard in this job. It's terrible. He was obviously arrested. It was a most terrible business. My friend, the lawyer, a big, tough guy, a man that was a very good AFL footballer in his day, the sort of guy you wouldn't really want to stand on his foot if you're in a pub. He was the principal of a very successful law firm. He had a lot of lawyers working for him. and he was at the peak of his powers in 2009. He subsequently had a silent breakdown, he confided to me, and he would get dressed each day in his suit and take his briefcase. But instead of going into his office where his lawyers were working for him and doing other cases, he would sit on a park bench in Richmond and just feed the pigeons or look at the sky or something. And eventually it got to him, his business broke down. He had to sell the business at a big loss because he couldn't cope with what had happened. He knew that had he not made that generous offer for Arthur Freeman to take the children away for the weekend, that this tragedy probably might not have unfolded the way it did. He was haunted by that. It wasn't his fault at all, but he was haunted by it, and it ruined him and wrecked him. And I hope if you're out there, Richard, that you're going well. Just while we're on Freeman, Justice Paul Coghlan, a very wise judge, sentenced Arthur Freeman to life in prison with a minimum term of 32 years. And he said this: any motive which existed for the killing had nothing to do with the innocent victim, which was the judge's way of referring to little Darcy. This recent incident in April this year was not the first time that Freeman was attacked in jail. Back in 2011, he was involved in a fight in Barwon Prison in which he not only fought another inmate, probably had been attacked by the inmate, but he bit an officer who tried to intervene. But apparently in the intervening 14 years he hasn't got much better at it, and he clearly lost the second round. This time round, the official statement from the prison is one prisoner was taken to hospital for further assessment. No other prisoners or staff were injured. Police also made a statement. They said a man was taken to hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. Detectives will investigate the circumstances surrounding the incident. Well, they will, and that'll be that. Another case that comes to mind, there are many of them, of course, sadly, but another one that comes to mind happened in 2015, and I actually went to the scene of the crime. If indeed you can call it a crime when mothers do terrible things to their children because they're in the grip of a psychological episode, though it's not a crime in the classic ordinary sense. This woman's name was Akon Goode. I will pronounce it Goode, G-U-O-D-E. She was, I think, a Sudanese woman. She's certainly an African immigrant who had come here from a war-torn country where terrible things had happened to her. I think her first husband had been shot dead in front of her. I think she had been savagely assaulted herself by rebel soldiers or militia, whatever it might be. And eventually she got to come to Australia as a refugee, a genuine refugee. And I believe she remarried because of the custom of the tribe she belonged to. I think she became the wife of her dead husband's brother or her dead husband's cousin or something like that. So she was sort of, through custom, forcibly married to this other man. She had twins and 2 other toddlers. She had children pretty rapidly. And by 2015, she was gripped by a terrible form of depression. She had been exposed, of course, to murderous, terrible things happening in her home country. She'd been savagely assaulted herself. And then when she got to Australia, hoping, I guess, to sort of heal those wounds, she'd been, it would appear, strong-armed into a marriage with a relative of her husband that may not really have suited her. And so she became very depressed. And in 2015, she put her 4 children in a little silvery grey car, and she drove to a small suburban lake at Wyndham Vale in the west of Melbourne. And she deliberately drove that vehicle into the lake. And I can't recall exactly how she got out, but she somehow got out, or someone swam out and got her. She was rescued, apparently. She didn't die. But her children did. So what we had later that day, and I remember going to the scene, and it was a very gruelling thing to see the actual car sitting there, the doors open in the water and filled with water, just the roof showing, to realise what had happened, and that brave passers-by managed to rescue this woman, but the children drowned. A terrible thing to have happened, and someone in the grip of a terrible depression. Akon Good, in 2018, was eventually jailed for 26 years after pleading guilty to the murder of her twins and to the infanticide of her little toddler, Bol, and also the attempted murder of her daughter, Alul. The concept of children being drowned by a parent, deliberately or accidentally, reminds us, of course, of a case that has resonated for 20 years. Actually, to be precise, it's just over 20 years since Robert Donald William Farquharson did what he did. Now, this is a more controversial case now than it was at the time, I have to say. It was always a big case, and it always created much fear, horror and loathing, naturally, because what we had here, on the face of it at least, was a sort of revenge killing, a cold-blooded revenge killing was the way the prosecution presented it twice in court, and both times Robert Farquharson was convicted of deliberately drowning his own three boys, his three children. As a way, the prosecution argued, of getting back at his ex-wife, Cindy Gambino. This was allegedly the classic divorce jealousy motive. This was the classic example, according to the prosecution, of the husband and father getting back at the ex-wife, ex-partner by hurting their children. Now, this does happen, and terribly it happens too much, and it is always the most shocking of crimes. Now, whether Farquharson is guilty as convicted twice is interesting, because there is now some debate. 20 years later, there is some debate about the science used to convict him. But before we get to that, let's go through the story so far. Robert Farquharson was just an average little guy. He lived around Geelong, out Winchelsea way. He met Cindy Gambino in February 1990, and they began a relationship. Now, Cindy had, I think, been engaged to or married to someone who lost their life in a car accident, so maybe she married him on the rebound, in effect. In October 1994, their first son, Jai, was born. In 1996, Farquharson took a redundancy package from his job and he bought a lawn mowing franchise, which cost him $40,000. In July 1998, they had their second son, Tyler, and in the year 2000, Farquharson married Cindy Gambino. They then had another son, Bailey, in 2002. They had three young boys, and they were lovely-looking little kids, 2 years apart each, but this didn't stop the marriage falling apart. And in 2004, when young Bailey was only 2 years old, they separated, apparently amicably. It was said by experts later that Farquharson had avoidant personality disorder and bouts of depression, and he sought the assistance of a psychologist and later a psychiatrist to deal with the separation. He was prescribed the antidepressants sertraline and later mirtazapine. These are two moderately powerful drugs that are used by the psych profession to treat patients. Whether those drugs have a particular effect on some people, we don't know, but maybe they do. Now, here's the pointy bit of the story. At about 7 p.m. on the 4th of September 2005, as Farquharson was returning his children to their mother Cindy after a Father's Day access visit, His white VN Commodore veered across the Princes Highway between Winchelsea and Geelong. Now, this is a road that he knew very well because he lived out there and he would have travelled on that road hundreds of times. It crashed through a fence and it came to rest in a deep, 7.5 metre deep, disused former quarry turned farm dam. So this is not your normal farm dam that might be, 2 metres deep in the middle, like many of them. It's 7.5 metres deep and it's an ex-quarry, so it's got, I think, probably steep sides. It's a very big bit of water to drop a car into. The car is submerged. His 3 sons were unable to free themselves and drowned, although the oldest boy, his body was found free of his seatbelt and trying to get out a door, actually. Farquharson apparently managed to escape, and he alerted another driver up on the highway, ran up to the road, who took him to nearby Winchelsea. Police divers recovered the boys' bodies about 2 a.m. the next day, that is after midnight, the same night. They were still inside the vehicle, not restrained by seatbelts. After a 3-month investigation, police prepared murder charges against Farquharson and went to his Winchelsea home on the 14th of December 2005. He was not there at the time, but presented himself at Geelong Police Station with his lawyer, which is fair enough. Everybody's entitled to go to a police station with their lawyer, and smart people do. And I would point out that whenever police are accused of anything, they lawyer up and they give no comment interviews. So let's not, say that he shouldn't have done that. However, some parents out there might feel that if you were a genuinely grieving father who'd lost 3 children, that you wouldn't really feel the need to lawyer up and all that sort of stuff. He was arrested, charged with 3 counts of murder. He had previously requested and undertaken a lie detector test, the results of which were inadmissible in court. Now, in this country, lie detectors have no legal standing. They can't be used as evidence in court. They're interesting, though, because sometimes people will volunteer for them in the hope and belief that it will clarify where they stand in relation to an accusation, that if you're accused of doing something bad and you pass a lie detector test, it might get the police off your back, despite the fact that it doesn't clear you legally in court. It may well persuade the homicide squad or the armed robbery squad or somebody that you weren't there and you didn't do it, and that they'd look elsewhere for a result, for an arrest. Farquharson later appeared in the Geelong Magistrates Court, where he was remanded in custody and ordered to appear back in April 2006, which of course is 20 years ago precisely. The police alleged that Farquharson had been in control of his Commodore in the moments before it crashed, and that he earlier told a friend, a fellow called Greg King, that he had intended to kill his children to get back at his wife. He was later granted bail and released from custody. Now, this apparent information or comment to his friend Greg King is very interesting. If it's true that he said, I'm going to get back at that bitch Cindy by killing my kids, well, that would be extremely damning. But I don't know that there's evidence that he presented it as strongly as that. Again, it might have gained a little bit of mayonnaise in the retelling. It's hard to know. Subsequently, interestingly, after he was convicted the first time, Farquharson was granted a retrial, and one of the reasons was, I think, that Greg King, it turns out his mate, had his own problems with the police. He'd been arrested over something or charged with something. And I think the Farquharson camp said, well, that makes his testimony problematic because possibly the police were leaning on him to support the police case a little more than he should have in order to curry favour with the police. That is not necessarily what happened. We're not suggesting that that's what happened. All we're saying is that Farquharson's defence counsel could raise that as a possibility, and indeed they did, and they got a retrial. Guess what happened at the retrial? Farquharson was convicted again. Again, a jury found that beyond reasonable doubt he had murdered his own children. with a planned event. Now, common sense stuff says it looks like murder. He knows the road. He runs off the road at a particular point and the wheel tracks of the car head straight for this water. That is interesting. His defence essentially was that he had a coughing fit and that he had a rare thing called a coughing syncope, I think it's called. It's a funny word, syncope. And that this rare coughing fit thing makes you black out and that you can just not know what's happened for, some space of many seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever it might be. And I know that the coughing fit defence has been used by others and it's been used successfully, I understand, by police, saying that they coughed as they went through a red light or something like that. So it's a offence that can be mounted. At the time when Farquharson faced two different juries, one soon after the other, the juries didn't believe his version of events. Now, most of us would be pretty sceptical about this. One of the things that convinces me that on balance the juries were right is this. I once happened to be talking to a policeman who worked at Geelong at the time of the children's death. And in fact, he was there when the phone calls came in, the first phone calls, and he was there when a friendly motorist brought Farquharson to the police station to talk about it. And he said everybody at the police station was devastated by this dreadful event. They felt overwhelmingly sorry for this poor father who's run off the road and had his kids drowned. There was no suspicion at that time of him. It just seemed like a monumentally terrible accident. But he said the strange thing was that Farquharson didn't present as someone who was shattered by the event. And he didn't say the things that made them think he was shattered by the event. He said his first words to this policeman were, I suppose I'm in a lot of trouble now. Or a question like, does this mean I'm in a lot of trouble now? Should I get a lawyer? Or words to that effect. And the policeman found this very jarring. He was quite prepared to be really sympathetic to this poor man, only to have this man say something that was totally self-interested and wasn't showing compassion for his dead children, only concern about his own legal position. He was worried about, whether he'd be prosecuted for something. And at that point, there was no suggestion he'd be prosecuted for anything. Funny how he leapt to that conclusion. Some would suggest a consciousness of guilt. And the consensus was over some days, as police talked to other police who then talked to the homicide squad and so on, the consensus was that Farquharson was as guilty as sin and that he'd planned the whole thing, and it was just the cold-blooded revenge of a sad little man who resented the fact that his wife had gone off with somebody else. As he said to somebody at the time, not only that, she took the good car. Apparently they had two cars in the family, and when they split up, she took the newish car, the better car, and he got the old one. And that this festering resentment of everything that had happened to him meant that he struck back in what he probably thought was the only way he could, which was an incredibly evil, self-centred thing to do. The action of a quiet sociopath, really, a terrible thing. Of course, in these sort of cases, it comes down to experts at 10 paces. The prosecution's got their expert, the defence has got their expert, and they contradict each other, which must make things pretty tough for a jury. Matthew Norton, an associate professor and specialist in sleep and respiratory medicine, told one of the juries that it was highly unlikely that Farquharson had had a coughing fit in the moments before the accident. He further testified that coughing to the point of blacking out is extremely rare and that it was unlikely that he'd had such an attack while driving given the warmth of his vehicle. Apparently this coughing fit is brought on by coldness, cold air. But this evidence was later contradicted by other experts who disagree with it. One interesting angle here is that the owner of the property where the dam was testified that the dam is on a paddock on a curve, and that 7 vehicles had crashed through his farm fence in 8 years. So although Farquharson knew the road and all that, it was the evening, it was dark, he might have been coughing, he might have had a couple of drinks, we don't know. But it's so interesting that 7 cars, that's one a year essentially, had gone through the fence and into that paddock. None of them, however, had struck the dam, which is interesting that the dam is only a very small subset of the paddock. The others had gone through the fence, they had not struck the dam. It seemed to the police and the prosecutors that having breached the fence, that Farquharson had made a beeline for the dam. Maybe he was just unlucky. Now, we have to be fair here and point out that in recent times there has been a movement which suggests that junk science has infiltrated some legal processes and given juries the wrong idea about what's right and what's wrong, what happened, what didn't happen. Now, there are some eminent cases where that is obviously true. The biggest one, of course, the biggest one in the world probably, is Lindy Chamberlain, that she was convicted essentially on bodgy scientific evidence that the sound deadener, stuff like tar, used to sound deaden the car body of the car they were using when they were camping near Uluru all those years ago. The evidence was given by someone who should have known better, was that this material was not just tar or paint or something. It was in fact, claimed this alleged expert, fetal blood, meaning the blood of a baby, and that it had gone thick and hard and tarry, and that's what it was. The reality was it wasn't. It was sound deadener. There were other alleged experts used in the Dingo trial, the Lindy Chamberlain trial, famously, and we've all heard it before. One of them, an English alleged expert on dogs or something, claimed that a tooth mark, an apparent tooth mark in a bit of clothing, had been actually made with scissors. This expert said, no, that won't be a dog bite or a dingo bite, that'll be made with scissors. And the reality is that he may be wrong. It might be either, a triangular blade of scissors and a sharp dingo tooth may very well make precisely highly similar cuts in a piece of cloth. Now, Lindy Chamberlain was convicted on that sort of bodgy evidence, plus a lot of slanted police stuff, plus a lot of slanted media stuff, plus a lot of propaganda promulgated by the Northern Territory government of the day that wanted to protect their tourist economy, etc., etc. But Lindy Chamberlain became naturally the poster girl for wrongful conviction when she was finally cleared, as she should have been. But she's not the only person that's been wrongly convicted. There have been other examples. There was a young African man convicted in Melbourne of the rape of a middle-aged woman in a pub nightclub thing in Doncaster, where it was alleged that this young man had dragged this 40-something woman into a cubicle of a lavatory toilet and raped her, assaulted her. The reality was he'd never been there. He'd never been to Doncaster, let alone to the venue. The reality was that his DNA had accidentally contaminated the exhibits for another case entirely, that someone in the lab at the forensic science place had managed to get a little speck of his DNA on a totally separate case on to the exhibits associated with the Doncaster woman, the rape at the Doncaster Hotel. This young man was arrested, he was charged, he was convicted entirely on this bodgy DNA evidence, and he was locked up for quite a while until finally it was overturned and he was released and he was paid out. He was paid compensation, but I would have said not a hell of a lot given what he went through. We have seen other examples of this along the journey, and we've mentioned them here in Life and Crimes. A notable one, another DNA bungle, was when the homicide squad thought briefly that they'd solved the murder of Margaret and Shauna Tapp, a mother and daughter who'd been murdered in Ferntree Gully back in 1984. And suddenly they jumped up a few years ago, back in the 2012 or whatever it was, and said, we know who did it. It's this guy that's locked up in Sale Jail, Fulham Prison, that is. His name is Russell Gieser, and his DNA matches DNA taken from the scene of the crime, and they were wrong. It was a bungle in the laboratory. It turned out that Russell Gieser could not possibly have done the double murder at Ferntree Gully in 1984. I'm guessing because he was probably still living in Thursday Island or Rockhampton or somewhere at the time, and provably so. He had a watertight alibi. The reason for bringing these things up is that science and alleged science can get it wrong, and that when juries and judges and prosecutors and police believe implicitly in science presented to them, it can go dreadfully wrong. And my reason for bringing it up in this context is that it could be, as some people argue, that Robert Farquharson and various other people have been wrongly convicted because the science was wrong. Personally, I think the jury probably got it right in the Farquharson case for other reasons. The way he behaved, for his motive and his behaviour. I think that was very convincing and, in fact, convinced two juries. The science of it is messy. These are terrible cases for everybody involved. It's terrible for the lawyers, the police, the judges, the witnesses, because at bottom it's about that very unnatural crime of parents harming their children. It seems even worse in the eyes of the community and the law when the children are big enough to understand that, to know that they're being hurt by the people who should love them and protect them. And that, I think, makes the Arthur Freeman and Darcy Freeman case one of the worst we've ever heard about, because there's no doubt that he's guilty. There's no doubt he did what he did. He wasn't convicted on a theory or on scientific evidence. He stopped the car on a Westgate Bridge. He got out of the car. He opened the door. He dragged his 4-year-old daughter out and he threw her over the guardrail of the Westgate Bridge. And that is why when you go over that bridge now, for the last several years, you'll note that there are very tall, inward curving guardrails built to stop people jumping off the bridge or throwing things off the bridge. By and large, it's because of what happened to Darcy Freeman. In that sense, I hope she did not die in vain. It might have saved other lives. Thanks for listening. Life and Crimes is a Sunday Herald Sun production for True Crime Australia. Our producer is Jonty Burton. For my columns, features and more, go to heraldsun.com.au/Andrew Rule, one word. For advertising inquiries, go to newspodcastssold@news.com.au. That is all one word, newspodcastssold. And if you want further information about this episode, links are in the description.